Hello and welcome to ChooseFI. Today on the show, I have my good friends Doug and Carl from Mile High Fi podcast. And they actually joined me about 6 months ago. And we just had such a fun time that I knew they'd be the perfect people to invite back for this specific episode. And I actually, since this is, as we've always called it, the ultimate crowdsourced personal finance show, I got this email from Maggie that I just thought was really, really interesting and insightful, where she basically was curious. She's in her 20s, her and her husband, and they're wondering, are they on track for FI? And what were you thinking about? What were you thinking when you were my age? So, Doug, Carl, and I are all three of us, we're in our 40s, and we're able to look back on our fairly short time to FI, albeit from Maggie's standpoint, it's probably a significant point, and maybe look back at those checkpoints, look back at what we were thinking at each stage, and are you on track? I think this should be a really, really fun conversation and an interesting perspective for the community. So, with that, welcome to ChooseFI. All right, Doug and Carl, my friends, thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting us. And it's always a blast catching up with you, Brad.
Yeah, Brad, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, you bet, guys. This should be fun. So Maggie followed up, and I will read the first email, but she followed up with basically 11 questions that she had, and we'll go through a bunch of them. But I think it's really an interesting perspective of, like she said, are you on track for FI? Because, I mean, frankly, guys, it's such an interesting journey to FI, right? Like, I think we all know that this is the antithesis of get rich quick. And there's great comfort in that, right? I think get rich quick usually ends up with you with an empty pocket and somebody else like laughing all the way to the bank. But that said, there's a fundamental truth, obviously, to FI, but that more intermediate term, it leaves some ambiguity. It leaves some, hey, am I doing this right? If there is even a right, am I on the right track? What are these checkpoints? What should I be thinking about? Because Maggie and her husband, they're in their 20s and they've learned a lot. They've been listening to ChooseFI. They've been following the community, but still, nevertheless, like there are things that you had planned when you were 27 that did come to fruition and things that were so totally off the mark that, I mean, looking back, the three of us in hindsight probably kind of laugh at our younger selves. So I think there's a lot here. There's almost maybe too much here for one episode, but we're going to give it our best shot. So I guess let's even start back. Like when you were in your mid 20s, where were you on your financial path? Did personal finance even come in? Because obviously we all know for the three of us, like the modern five movement started in the early 2010s, probably, right? Mr. Money Mustache, Jacob from Early Retirement Extreme. So we obviously were already on our personal finance journey before that. So to say that we found FI might be a bit of an exaggeration, but let's start. Doug, where were you in your mid to late 20s on your personal finance journey?
Very lost. I didn't even know there was a path to be on. And jumping right into sort of the early retirement portion, I had a really good example. My dad was a firefighter and he retired when he was like 49 through, starting really early and just a couple little moves, but he had a pension and he knew he was going to be able to retire before he was 50. And I thought I couldn't do it. I thought, oh, I don't want to be a firefighter. I thought that potentially was like one of the only ways. So financially, completely lost. I didn't even know there was a path. I had some rolling credit card debt. I was telling Carl the other day, I could always pay everything off. So I had enough cash and I was like net positive, but just barely. And I had no clue what I was doing. I was kind of following the path of some of my other friends where, they were buying houses. So I bought a house kind of at a bad time in 2005 and completely lost in my 20s. And I'll leave it at that. It was a mess, train wreck.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's interesting when you said, I didn't even know there was a path to be on, right? And I think that puts Maggie and her husband and many, many, obviously tens or hundreds of thousands of people who are just finding FI already ahead of the game. So I think there's some level of reassurance here of like, wow, you mean you're 27 years old, you've already found FI? I would give anything for it to be in my 20s and already found FI. Like, so I think part of this is going to be a pep talk for people getting started who are uncertain. But I mean, Doug, you didn't know anything about anything at that point, right? I mean, you were just slightly net worth positive, let's say, right? but just barely at that.
Yeah, just barely. And if I would have purchased my house a few years earlier or a few years later, that potentially would have been a good investment. But it was a horrible one at the time and the circumstances and through, decisions that I made, obviously. So yeah, barely net positive. Then I bought the house and certainly negative at that point. I did get married in that early time frame there. I guess it was 29, so tail end. And my wife is very good. And she was like, "Do you have debt?" We had some conversations. We don't communicate really well about money, but at least she stepped in and said, "Do you have any debt? Let's pay that off. Let's get rid of that, small car loan that I had, a couple other things like that." And was starting to get on the right track at that point.
Okay, so that sounds like a turning point. Let's put a pin in that because I think that's probably going to be, I guess, an inflection point for
100%.
at least two of us. I suspect Carl as well. But Carl, let's in your 20s, where were you with personal finances?
Yeah. So, Doug, I think my story is going to make yours look really, really good because I graduated from university at the age of 25 and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew I liked science, so I studied that. Eventually wound up in pharmacy school. I realized that I thought being a pharmacist would suck. Sorry to pharmacists out there, Jonathan. It was my personality, not anything to do with a career. So I dropped out of that, did computers. I graduated at the age of 25 with $60,000 in debt. So 50,000 of that was college debt, 10,000 was credit card debt. Hey, that stereo looks good. I think I'll go out and buy it and put it on a credit card because I'm making $3.35 an hour. But the one thing that did happen to me at university, which was very good, I had this girlfriend who was a business major. And one day she comes home from class and says, "Hey, my accounting teacher told me about this nonprofit investing class we should go to." And I'm like, "Oh man, that just sounds horrible. Like I had no interest in money or any of that stuff. I would throw out the business section of the newspaper, just no interest." But I went to this thing. It was a weekend seminar. And these guys are like, "Hey, you have to invest in index funds. You have to do this and this." I'm like, holy cow. And I remember, Brad, at one time, this is probably the best thing anyone has ever said to me in my entire life. I was sitting in the back of the room. They had these cookies. So I was eating cookies. And this guy looked at me and to set the stage, the room was filled with seniors. Like we were both like 20 and everyone else there was like 60. I think there was even a couple 80 years old. So this guy locks eyes with me and says, "Your advantage is your youth. Start as soon as you can." And I'm like, what? I think unicorns jumped over my head and there was a rainbow. So I didn't know much about money, but I did know because of that weekend that as soon as I had it, I needed to get out of debt and start saving as aggressively and as soon as possible.
Huh. That's some incredible advice, right? Like one of those lightning bolt moments. Your advantage is your youth. Start as early as you can. I love that.
Yeah. And I've even tried to look this guy up to send him a thank you note, and I can't find him. I wish I could.
It's funny because when you said that this was filled with seniors, I'm thinking like seniors in college because that's what we're talking about here. This is actual seniors. So, yeah, that's interesting. Carl, I never knew you went to pharmacy school.
Yeah, I did only for 1 year. I thought the school was fascinating. I love organic chemistry, pharmacokinetics, all that stuff is interesting, but I knew the job wouldn't be that mentally stimulating. What caused me to drop out is they showed us a video of a robot filling prescriptions, and they said this robot can do 10,000 a day. It never messes up. A good pharmacist can do 300 a day and makes mistakes. How are we going to combat the robot? And in my head, I'm like, well, we shouldn't. Like, if the robot does the job better, it should have the job. I need to find something else to do in my life.
Wow.
And that was it.
A fateful moment for sure. That's wild. So, yeah, it's interesting. Just different perspectives, right? So, like in my 20s, I think I was fortunate in that I had that lightning bolt moment about personal finance a little bit younger. And it was just sheer luck. So I think that's another part of this Am I on Track is, wow, if you found FI in any way at really, I mean, essentially any age, but certainly like in your 20s or teens, like you are so far ahead of the game. It is preposterous. So I just want to say that from the outset. But like, again, I got really lucky. I had this internship would be a stretch, but we'll call it an internship at like I think it was Solomon Smith Barney back then. It was like an investing firm. And I learned very quickly, that industry was not for me because it was just salesmen. Basically, that's all anybody was doing. I was literally cold calling people in the old school, like Yellow Pages, so it's dating me a little bit, but the one positive thing that came from that summer internship was one of the CFPs sat me down in front of a compound interest calculator. And guys, I kid you not, like I met that at the right time, the right moment, and my brain just like exploded. Like you talked about, like unicorns, kittens, like everything, fireworks going off. Like that's what this was like essentially, because I was just sitting there playing with this. And I think we were putting in like, it was $2,000 was the old Roth IRA contribution limits. And I was just playing with, okay, at a 13% annual return, when I'm 99, this is going to be worth $1 billion. It was something crazy. But just to see compounding like that, that was one of those just absolute lightning bolt moments in my entire life. And that happened at, I forget it was probably 20 years old. So fortunately, I had at least that sense. And I then kind of compounded, if you will, haha. The positive with after college, I lived at home with my parents. And just for about 2 years, I saved about 90% of my income back then because I spent nothing. I was 22 years old. I had a paid off car. I basically paid for gas and some food and drink. That was about it. And just that absolute pedal to the metal savings really was the springboard that made the rest of my financial life easier. So I can't say it's like any brilliance on my own. I just like the only thing that I can say looking back is like somehow I didn't succumb to like the lifestyle inflation that a lot of my friends did. And I saw people at my accounting firm who were my contemporaries, right? 22, 23-year olds who were going out and buying BMWs or leasing BMWs, even worse, to prove like what big adults they were. They were renting one bedroom apartments on Long Island back then for $1,600 a month or something crazy like that. And like, I just never succumbed to that. I didn't need to impress anybody. And I think that was the thing that has served me best in life is that like for some reason internally, I didn't have that need or desire to impress anybody.
I'll jump in. You reminded me, Brad, that I was saving pretty well in retirement accounts early on. I don't have the specific memory that you guys do about seeing the compound interest tables. I know they were shown to me. So as soon as I did have access when I got a full-time job, I did, I think for maybe 2 or 3 years, first 2 or 3 years, maxed out my 401k, which that made a huge difference, obviously, compounding over 20 years. I mean, that does it right there.
Yeah, without a doubt. How did you know at that point to like invest in those vehicles?
I think I had maybe one of those senior classes where they did in senior as a senior in college, just to clarify
Yeah,
here,
we're mixing up the word senior here a lot.
where they were giving us a few life skills. It was an engineering class, and maybe the school I went to, the electrical engineers were ill equipped for real life or something like that. So they gave us a little bit more instruction. And part of it, I think, was like investing. And again, I don't remember a specific time where I was like, wow, compound interest is amazing. But I think I knew that I did want to save early on and it would make a difference. But I don't have that lightning bolt moment, which I wish I could remember now.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Let's go to Maggie's first two questions. I'm going to put these together. So, her first one was, what were your thoughts on FI when you were in your 20s? And then, second, I think that's probably not going to be as applicable to us because we weren't fully aware of FI. But I have something I wouldn't mind talking about with that. Second question was, personally, I'm set to hit FI when I'm in my late 40s, but that seems so far away, even though it's considered quote unquote early. Did you feel like your retirement was a long time away, even if it was sooner than the average person? So I think this kind of gets to what we've now affectionately known as the boring middle, which is a phrase that I love. So we just recently had Jess from the Pioneers on to talk very specifically about this. So the episode was titled The Cure for the Boring Middle. And I think this is something we can definitely talk about because, I mean, guys, like I said before, this is not get rich quick. It's probably for most people a minimum 15-year journey, which again, it's like on the one hand, that is so fast. I mean, to imagine that at any point somebody can find FI and in 15 to 18 years reach financial independence within reason, right? But 15 to 18 years is still a long time. So we're kidding ourselves if we think like, oh, we can just close our eyes and wait out 15 to 18 years. And I think that's probably where the three of us have updated our thinking the most probably over the last couple of years.
Yeah, for me, well, I first discovered Phi like sort of late, and I think it was only maybe 10 years ago when my wife and I started accumulating a little bit more money, trying to figure out how to invest it, fired our investors, that sort of thing, and didn't really pay attention. I didn't find Carl's blog. I didn't find Mr. Money Mustache and dive in like a lot of people in our space and a lot of our friends that we have now. So the big shift for me was finding like side hustles and entrepreneurship, which made things very interesting. So it really wasn't boring. And it actually represented a real shift where I had a corporate job for about 10 years and then started dabbling. After about 2 years of dabbling and learning and really kind of having a good time, I got laid off. So the path kind of opened up and I had an opportunity, a very scary and risky opportunity that I wasn't sure that I was up for, but I went for it because I really enjoyed the process. So for me, the side hustles and building my own job and becoming self-employed really changed everything. And I don't even consider myself retired. And I don't envision that happening exactly. I think maybe some well-placed sabbaticals or mini retirements could be interesting, but I've just shaped my work into fun and make it interesting where I'm learning and I have a good community and I have friends that do the same thing. So it makes it very worthwhile and rewarding for me.
So back to something you alluded to before, Brad, I think Maggie's so lucky to know about all this stuff and have this information in her 20s. And I look back on myself. I remember when I discovered FI, it was mid-October of 2012. Not that I'm a nerd or anything. I am a nerd. And I stumbled upon a Mr. Money Mustache article. Like, holy cow. It was one of the this is pathetic on my part, but one of the greatest days of my life, right up with getting married and the birth of my first child. Because the really interesting thing is, I was always
not the second child, but the first child.
After both of them. Girls, if you're listening to this, it's like number 4.
Mr. Money Mustache, right smack in the middle.
But it was so good. And I think it meant more to me because, like I said, I was a saver since I had that seminar in college. And at that time, we had about $600,000 in savings and almost $200,000 in home equity. But I'd been putting all this money away, Brad. I never knew what I was going to do with it. I was just doing it because that's what I was supposed to be doing. Then I discovered Mr. Money Mustache, and oh my God, here's why I'm saving. I just didn't know it. I don't have to work for that much longer. And with that said, I have no idea what your original question was, Brad. But I came at FI from a little bit different perspective in that I was already doing most of what I should have been doing. I just didn't know why I was doing it.
Yeah.
I think it was kind of around like the boring middle, but you didn't even know you were in the boring middle. You just thought you were living life for the future or something like that, right? You were just saving all through your 30s and everything, right?
Yeah, pretty much. The thing I ask myself, which is kind of interesting, is what would have happened if I never would have discovered this FI thing? I don't know if I ever would have come up with the idea by myself, or if I did, it would have been much later in life. So would I have hit 65 with like an obscene amount of money and just bought a private jet or something? I have no idea, but I'm glad it didn't work out like that.
Yeah, to me, that was the most important part about finding FI. So yeah, Maggie's question ultimately of what were your thoughts on FI when you're in your 20s, and I'll, because I found it in my 30s, so we'll take the 20s part out. And I think it's also important to say, like, this episode is not just for people in their 20s. I think that's the beautiful thing about FI is like, this is a mathematical equation at the end of the day. So let's not think, and this is so important, is that you don't need to find FI in your teens or 20s to succeed. I think like we're all cases in point here of you can start at any point. You can start in your 40s or 50s. It's still the same equation. I think that's what's so important. But it's also important to understand this is a psychological journey. And I think that cure for the boring middle is trying to figure out what you want to do in life, what an ideal day looks like, what an ideal week or month. And you're never going to get to that ideal, but maybe you can just try to experiment and have fun and see what works for you. And I think that's part of the fun of this. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit in that what I actually found when I found FI was, Carl, similar to what you were saying, is like, I don't know, even as like, you know, this is going to sound ridiculous, but like as smart about money and life as I think that I am, like, I don't think I ever would have come to the fact that, oh, wow, there's actually an end to this. Like I would have just kept working, I suspect, and accumulated a lot of money and saved 50% of my income, but to no end. And I think like that to me is one of the biggest superpowers of FI is it gives you some certainty about the end point. Now, we can all quibble at the margins about the 4% rule, or is it 5% because you're going to get Social Security? Is it 3.25%, in the absolute barring zombie apocalypse, like that's going to be the perfect safe withdrawal rate? Like, frankly, I don't care about any of that stuff. You pick whatever you want, basically in between 3 and 5% as a back of the envelope. And that's fine for you. You obviously have whatever the adjustments need to be. But as far as I'm concerned, having that number to shoot for and understanding the mechanics of, oh, you mean if I have $1 million, I can probably pull out between $30,000 and $50,000 a year, and I can live off that. Okay, well, if my expenses are somewhere between 30 and 50,000, which I certainly have control over, well, then I've got something, right? Like, oh, but what if my expenses were $100,000 a year? Am I shut out of the FI world? No, of course not. It just means you need probably $2.5 to $3 million, and that's fine. We all make decisions, but at least having that degree of certainty, guys. I mean, for me, that was the aha moment that changed everything.
One question for you both. Had either of you ever known, like in your life, anyone who retired early? Because I never had. Everyone in my family, some of them worked until they were like in their 80s or 90s. And one thing that Mr. Money Mustache did for me is here's someone not just talking about it, but here's an example of it. And then I met him in real life and knew that it wasn't just some fake internet thing. So did either of you have a role model?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because Doug mentioned before about his dad, who's a firefighter and had a pension. And my dad was similar, actually. He's like the only person I know who, quote unquote, retired early. And it was basically, he very intentionally took a job that would give him a pension, even though it gave him a smaller salary than he otherwise would have in his profession. He was an attorney for the Long Island Railroad, but he could have went into private practice and made a lot more money. But he knew they had this amazing pension, and he set that plan in place probably at 26 years old, and it worked out great for him. And he was able to retire. I think it was somewhere right around 50, I want to say. So, I mean, by any definition, that's pretty early. So that certainly was something that I said, wow, there's something to this. Like there actually is potentially an off ramp to working forever, basically.
Do you ever remember like connecting those dots specifically? Because I really didn't.
Yeah,
When
same.
I literally saw my dad retiring early, I was like, I don't want to be a firefighter or work in public service, so I don't know how I'm going to do it.
Yeah, Doug, that's so interesting. I did not connect the dots. And in fact, I probably took like the low agency version of it, like the external locus of control, negative mindset of, oh, he had a pension, like that was easy. Or like, oh, there's no pensions anymore. You can never do that. So blah, 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 blah. It's like the antithesis of how I live my life now is like I try to live like high agency and internal locus of control. And that was the exact opposite, which is like, outside forces controlling, right? And this was a scenario where, oh, of course, all the companies went away from pensions, yada, yada, yada. So, yeah, basically, I took no positive lesson from that whatsoever. But I think probably just seeing it happen in the background was somewhat useful.
And then follow up on that, I had the same thoughts, right? So I was thinking, there's no pensions. I probably won't get one of those jobs. But this is a deeper question. Your internal locus of control, when do you think that started to shift?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really deep question. I think for me, and this is going to almost sound trite or like revisionist history, but I genuinely believe this. I think it was when I found Mr. Money Mustache and then the stock series. So this was before the Simple Path to Wealth. So the stock series with JL Collins. So at jlcollinsnh.com, which, that still exists. But I think for me, finding the shockingly simple math behind early retirement, understanding the 4% rule, and then finally understanding investing were the two moments that changed everything for me when it came to personal finance. Because I think if you really dig into the heart of it, that changed the locus of control. Because, so let's say with investing, most people think you need to basically outsource your investing to somebody smarter than you, somebody who has some secret knowledge, somebody like some other they. And the stock series and now the Simple Path to Wealth changes that entirely, right? It's, hey, I understand this. There's a simplicity to this. I think long term, and I have a 40 to 50 year investing timeline. I can't beat the market over 50 years. I just can't. So now I have some certainty of, oh, I just need to do this. I can do this on my own. I can do this for very low cost. And it's me, me, me. It's not some other they who has different incentives than me. And I think, again, just to finish this quickly, is finding shockingly simple math was like, oh, you mean I actually control what it costs? Like, it's based on what I spend. It's not based on some random like retirement calculator that's based on what I currently earn, which is ridiculous and totally fundamentally flawed. Like, it's based on what I spend. That's what I actually need to cover. So I think those two concepts changed that entirely.
What about you, Carl? I guess it was the same day, this magical day, right up there with getting married. But I guess it was finding Pete's blog. And then after that, I mean, you were investing before, right? So you felt like you had some control, but you had a different style, which I mean, I think maybe you still have a little bit of a different style of investing, right?
Yeah, I probably do. Actually, when we opened up, I said that I learned about index funds at that seminar in college, and I did not. It was mutual funds. I did not know what an index fund is until I found JL Collins, which was after I discovered FI. I was probably 40 when I discovered what an index fund is. So I just bought stocks because that's what I knew. But what was your original question, Doug?
Just the internal locus of control versus external, or if you had such a switch.
Yeah, I can't point to any specific moment. It's just very gradual. As you accumulate money, you accumulate confidence too, I think. And it's liberating. If money can do anything for you, it shouldn't be to buy crazy stuff. It should be to give you security and confidence and autonomy over your life. It took me a long time. Like, even after I made my goal, I did not retire. And now we have a lot more. And I think I'm finally in a good place, but it's probably only in the past year that I'm really comfortable with the pile of money we have and secure and knowing that it's going to last us for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and that security is really important. And that's why I said before, the psychological nature of this is, I think, the hardest to overcome. And I know all three of us have really changed our mindsets recently. I think the book that we've mentioned so many times, Die with Zero, has been a big part of that. But I think it speaks to a larger evolution of the FI community and the FI mindset, which was maybe when we found Pete and this community in 2013, 2014, 2012 for you, Carl, a lot of this was about how quickly can I get to a number? Can I, whether this was explicitly stated or not, how much can I cut and how much can I save? And it was just, there was no aspect of like the life part of this. And I think, Doug, I want to get you in here because I think this is the heart of Maggie's question is like, did you feel like your retirement was a long time away, even if it was sooner than the average person? And I think that's like a shorthand for, all right, you've got all these years. You can't wish them away. You have to maybe find out what life really looks like for you. And I'm curious your thoughts on that and like how you've seen yourself evolve.
I don't want to steal too much of Carl's thunder because I think some of it does come with things that I've actually learned from Carl. And once you hit that number, right, it's the destination. Once you get there, you're going to find something, but it's probably not going to be all the answers to everything. So you have to enjoy the journey. And we've talked about it a little bit. They're in their late 20s. That's great. You guys are going to crush it. Like Carl and I had no idea until our mid 30s or so. We did a couple good things. So we were in a nice position to shift our focus and make great progress. But at the end of the day, like those 15, 20 years that she's looking at, those are going to be awesome. Those are great years. Those are really fun years where you're very hopefully eager to travel physically, like probably in the best shape of your life. And you have to find a way to enjoy the journey along the way. So, like I said, I don't want to steal everything from Carl. What do you have to layer on top?
Yeah, I think the whole point of FI is for happiness and to improve our life. And if you're denying yourself those two things just to get to that number, you're not doing it well. One of the things I heard recently, which I thought was great, was Brad, you were on the All the Hacks podcast with our friend Chris Hutchins, and you mentioned your brother, and tell me if I'm stating the story wrong, but I believe you said he's not FI yet, but he's taking like a year or two off to spend time with his young children. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, that's super good. That's exactly what you should do with money. I love that even though he's not FI yet, he's taking the time and he's going to probably postpone FI a little bit. But that's great. Now he's making these great memories with his young kids. He can go back to school or he can go back to work after the kids are in school and continue on his journey. But yeah, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, agreed. I'm so impressed that they decided to do that. And it's just such like a wonderful thing for their young family. And Doug mentioned before in passing about like sabbaticals and mini retirements. And I know our good friend Jillian Johnsrud talks about this really wonderfully. And she was on the show not all that long ago talking about mini retirements. So that's what my brother and his wife did here. They have a really young daughter. They have a 1-year-old, and they just realized like this time is fleeting. And these years we can't get back. And yeah, I mean, they made the decision to move back to Wisconsin, where Kristen's from. And they're not at Phi, but they have basically decided. And again, everything in life, I think, is like it's a trade off, right? Like you have to make decisions. And for them, it's we're going to live a really lean life, still a wonderful life. I mean, they're living an absolutely wonderful life, but by any objective measure, it's a very lean life in terms of cost. Okay. But they made a very smart decision again because they were on the path to Phi. They hadn't reached Phi, but they were on the path to Phi. They were able to purchase a 3-bedroom condo in cash, and their living expenses are nothing. So they basically just spend on food and entertainment and utilities. And okay, does that look like spending $200 a month for a personal trainer like I'm doing, or going to some fancy gym? Like, no, they go to the YMCA, which is still wonderful, right? But like, it's little trade-offs. They're not going out to dinner all the time, but they're able to take a couple years off and spend that as a family of 3, which again, everybody makes their own decision. Like I almost reflexively said, like, of course you would do that, because that's where my brain goes. Like that seems to be so self-evident, but it's not to everybody, because some people, that's not the decision they would make. And that's perfectly fine. I think that at the end of the day, we all make decisions, right? But like, I'm really happy for them. I think it's like the perfect example of like this little mini retirement built into how do you live a wonderful life, not how do you just race to a number on a screen.
Yeah, I'm trying not to be too cynical here, but it always cracks me up when people say that I don't want to pursue FI because it's a compromise. And then I hear a story like your brother, like that's the ultimate thing you can do. Give your kids your time when they're young. So I would say the way most people live is probably a compromise because they can't have that experience similar to your brother. Like that's just incredible.
One follow-up, we're in this community, right, where this is maybe like a normal thing. We're patting each other on the back for all this stuff. But externally, it could be really tough to deal with. Do you know if your brother had any people in his life, friends, relatives, whatever, neighbors who are like, this is a really bad decision. Like, don't do this. Because I could imagine if you're in a corporate setting, that would be completely different. They're like, oh, you're committing career suicide here. Like, you're never going to be able to recover from this. You're losing years of income, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think it's a bit of an interesting situation in that my side of the family is, us and my parents who have already kind of drunk the Kool-Aid. So I don't think they got any pushback. But I think it's one of those things where, like, when you explain something, and this kind of, Carl, goes to what you were saying before about like who's really sacrificing. Like when you explain that you're doing this so you can spend time as a family in like these most important years, like, is there anybody on earth who would actually say like, no, I'd rather have a Rolex or like go out to like fancy steak dinners instead and like stick my kid in daycare and both of us work 60 hours a week? And that's not to castigate people who make those decisions generally. It's not like daycare is bad. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm just saying, like, is there anybody who would actually straight face say that to his face and actually mean it? And like, then I wonder, like, what's actually fundamentally broken in their soul? So, and maybe this is gives you a little more insight into my own brain. Is like, I feel like the decisions that I make, like, I'm so comfortable and confident with them that like I don't feel like I'd have any trouble explaining myself to anyone on earth. And I feel like the path to Phi is like a fundamental truth. And so, yeah, again, it's a little insight into my own soul, a little more than I normally do. But yeah, that's where my brain goes originally.
Yeah, I'll push back against Doug a little bit. I remember when I was in school, I had to go to see a guidance counselor to do my resume. And they're like, you never want to have a gap in your resume. That's bad. Like an employer will see that and it's going to be a big red flag. I don't think that's a thing anymore. I think employers encourage you to take time off for personal growth and to read and study. I know companies like Google and Amazon and Apple even encourage that kind of thing. And a lot of them will even hold your job. I know Apple does this. You can come back and get your job within a certain amount of time. So Maggie, if you're listening, don't be discouraged. I don't think a gap in your resume is going to kill your career if you decide to take time off for your children.
I don't think I'm the caliber that can work at Google or Apple or any of the places you mentioned, but this is very nice of you.
Oh, man. And Carl, before when you were saying about, okay, what do you have to give up? Or like, oh, you might be giving up too much, like some corners of maybe even the financial independence world, maybe like the fat fi type of world might push back and say like, oh, I don't want to give anything up. And I think it's a false construct personally. Like I'm just going to live and spend as much money as I want. And if my life costs $400,000 a year, then okay, there's just a mathematical equation to it. And while I think that is true, I still think it's this false construct in that, like, there's no free lunch ultimately, right? Like, I think what the opportunity cost is that I don't think people are taking into account is their life and the number of years, right? And like, it's all well and good to say, I want the finer things in life. And I mean, I do too, also. And I think this is part of where some of Maggie's questions are going later is like, how have we changed over the years? And I think that's important to talk about. But you, by needing more, in essence, by needing more to cover your life every year, you had to have given up, almost by definition, more years of your life to save that amount of money. And I think that's all well and good. But if you think this is just some free lunch of, okay, I'm going to live fat fi, or I'm going to spend $200,000, $300,000 a year, again, that's fine. But be very mindful of the cost. And the cost is the only resource you can never get back, which is your time. It is the only resource that is not renewable. So I think that's kind of my slight pushback. I love our FatFi community, but my slight pushback is there's always a cost. Nothing is free in life.
Yeah, Brad, I would say I am FatFi, and I've had some pretty cool FatFi experiences this year. I had a private concert. I took a ride on a helicopter, and most recently I saw U2 at the Sphere, which was an expensive concert ticket. But I think about all these things, and then I think of the pecking order of what's important to me in life. And those things are cool. I loved them. They were great. But spending time with my kids, being fit, eating well, like all these things that are really important are the things that I need time to do and don't cost a lot of money. So yeah, if I had to give up FatFi, yeah, I didn't intend to be FatFi. We just did well with some investments, but you need to figure out what's important to you. And I think for most people, the core things that are really important to them, it sounds so cliche. I almost feel stupid saying this, but they don't cost a lot of money, like to spend quality time, to take a nice walk with your partner. Like those things don't cost money. And that's what basic FI gives us. It gives us our time, like you said, Brad.
Yep. And I wouldn't necessarily lump us in the fat fi area, but I guess it depends on how folks define it. But like you said, there's just trade-offs. There's trade-offs that you have to make. And when you were describing your brother and the lean lifestyle, I was a little jealous because it's pretty easy to trade up. You know, when they get back into the working world, they're going to be able to step into, wherever they want. They can keep it the same. They can spend a little more, get a new car, get a new house, whatever they want to do or not, right? And it's 100% fine, really easy to trade up. But once you get your Tesla, it's going to be tough to go back, Carl, to a lesser car. And in some ways, I think of our friends Matt and Joel at How to Money and, what's your craft beer equivalent? And they spend money on craft beer. And that's great. They get a lot of joy out of it. Usually there's some community or social aspect to it. And I think of it that way. So what's your craft beer equivalent? And there's a handful of things that are high priority for us and a lot more that are not a priority. And it is a trade-off and we're comfortable with that. So I have an old truck or I have, whatever. Carl gets all his clothes at Costco, stuff like that. Right. Looks great though. Looks great.
Thanks, Doug. I love Costco.
Yeah.
I had dinner there last night.
You said.
The roast beef sandwich, though, we splurged. It was $10, and Mindy and I are like, man, like the hot dog's $1.50. We're like, no, let's go for the roast beef. We'll split it. It was good.
Fat fi all the way, Carl. I like it. But yeah, this fat fi conversation, I think is an interesting one. And this kind of ties into Maggie's later question about how has your original fi number changed? And Carl, I'm curious, like, as now you said, you've almost like fallen backwards into fat fi. And I guess on some level, I have two. And certainly my spending the last year or two has increased fairly dramatically. But I think that's very intentional, again, with the intersection of die with zero and, as we've talked about, the wait but why, and the tail end of my kids being 12 and 15 now, and wanting to maximize these next 3 to 6 years, basically. So it's very intentional about spending more on experiences and travel and time with them. But I wonder if my FI number has actually changed, or if this is like Doug, you just said, like, you never go back. I wonder if you can go back. Like, I'm not 100% sure. So, like, I guess my short answer to Maggie is, like, I think by any definition, my spending has gone up dramatically. Our spending has gone up dramatically. But I haven't actually updated my FI number in my own head because I'm not sure what the permanent spending level is. And I think that's actually kind of fun in a sense that, like, I don't have to micromanage it anymore. And I think that's kind of a real luxury, obviously, that I don't need to just constantly be doing the math of, oh, we spend this, I need to multiply it by 25, and am I over or under? Like, I'm not actually thinking about it. So I, I don't know that there's actually like a conclusion here, other than I think I've found myself mentally free and freed more now than I ever have been with my personal finances. And it feels very comfortable. But I'm also mindful in the back of my head of some luxuries that I've built into my life now, that maybe at a different stage of my life, or if something calamitous happened, let's say, right? That I think I could unwind some of these things very easily. Like, I just started like this new kind of fun premium coffee thing that's actually very cool, worth talking about another time. But, and also, like, as silly as it sounds, like, my wife and I, we're busy. We're shuttling kids left and right. Like, we want to eat more vegetables and healthy food. We're literally buying pre-cut vegetables now, even though it's 4 times as much as just buying a head of cauliflower or broccoli. And that's okay. But, like, do I think I'm going to do that for the rest of my life? Well, maybe, but maybe not. So I'm still thinking in the back of my head of, like, could I unwind some of this? And I think I very easily could. It's just, I don't want to be a miser if I don't need to, because my goal is not to accumulate $100 million. It's just, it's not. It's to live a great life. And that allows me these little things at the margin. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm curious where you guys are with this.
Yeah, I think you alluded to it, Brad. Something I think a lot about too is being in a fat fire situation hasn't really changed our life that much. We still live in the same house and do the same thing, same gym and all that, but it's taken like you said, the little decisions. For example, I bought Tillamook cheese, which is the really nice cheese. I didn't buy the cheap one. And just because I like Tillamook, I was at their factory a couple of years ago and it's great. So yeah, I think that's the main thing it does for me as well, Brad. It lubricates day-to-day life. That might not be a good way to put it, but it takes the what's a better way to put it? I have no idea, but it makes day-to-day life a little bit. You take the thought out of that. We don't have to think about every single thing we purchase and do. We can just go ahead and do it without giving it that much thought. Like buying the $10 roast beef sandwich at Costco. Like, it was okay.
For us, a little bit different. So in my head, we had a specific FI number that was maybe a little too aggressive for what my wife was comfortable with. Plus, like I said, I come from the side hustle entrepreneurship side. So I'm thinking I can create value in the world. I can keep working. I don't need to retire. I can scale up, scale down, create new businesses. Again, very confident, just like you, Brad. So I'm thinking things will be fine, even if some unexpected just happenings go on. So we've had actually a bit of a struggle with that over time, because I was like, yeah, we've hit FI. And my wife didn't really think so. She's operating more on like a 3 or 3.25% just to translate it over, and really wants to have a solid plan for like 45 or 50 years, which is great to plan that far, but you have to have a lot of contingencies. You're thinking long-term healthcare, just end of life stuff, which is good to think about. But I was thinking maybe we'll plan for that in 30 years. Like, maybe we don't need to plan it out right now. So it has led to some friction. So for us, not only has it kind of shifted, but for me, I felt like the goalpost kept moving further out, which has been a little stressful. But at the end of the day, everything works out fine, being more conservative, because I think after, maybe I take a sabbatical, she quits her full-time job, then we go for a couple years, we'll have a very good view of how much we're spending in retirement. And I think after a couple years, then we could open it up because you both have stopped working like for a couple years. So you've seen some sequence of returns. You've seen how this is working, and we haven't hit that point yet.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to everybody's in a different situation, right? Like in my case, we haven't started withdrawing money because I have some of these side businesses that make enough to cover our lifestyle. So that's another aspect of kind of fat fi, if you will, of like my money or ChooseFI, however you want to term whatever these crazy terms are we throw around these days. Like it's some combination of all of them in the sense that, yeah, like I haven't had to withdraw. So my money is just compounding in the background, which is interesting. But that's not to say these businesses are going to be around forever by any means. That is going to come to a stop. So, yeah, I think this whole thing, it's all just very interesting. I think a lot of it then comes back to like this next question that Maggie asked, which I think is interesting. She asked a very specific question, but I'm gonna make it broader and then throw it to you guys, which is she said, now that you've read Die with Zero, do you think you would have taken bigger/better vacations earlier had you read that then? Or do you think that you can only say that now that you've quote made it? And I think this is actually part of my concern, slight concern, albeit, about where we are today at ChooseFI or in the FI community. That I think because so many of us have been in this community for a while, and that we're maybe at a more advanced stage in our FI journey, maybe even approaching a FI or FadFi, that we have been able to loosen the purse strings a lot. And where we are in our lives and journey is we can spend a little bit more. So that's not inherently bad, obviously. But where my concern is would my mindset have been different knowing then what I know now in my late 20s, early 30s? And I think the implication is, am I giving bad advice to people potentially that, oh, you should be spending more? Because I think, frankly, like part of this journey is some aspect of delayed gratification, right? Like part of this is I'm putting in the work, albeit still living a great life, but I'm putting in the work for that 10, 12, 15 years on my FI journey. And then it's setting up the rest of my life to be dramatically easier. So I don't personally think, I guess my short answer to Maggie's question is like, I don't think that I would have done a lot differently in my 20s and 30s if I knew then what I know now. I think I would have been a little looser at the margins with some expenses. Like I think my wife and I didn't hire a babysitter literally ever. And we only had like date nights or whatever when my parents or her parents came down. It was like, would it really have killed us? Like, would it really have killed us to get a babysitter for 3 hours? Because in our heads, we're like, oh, well, that's going to be $20 an hour. And then the dinner is going to be another. Like, we were thinking about the nuts and bolts of the money as opposed to just saying, like, we're talking $100 probably twice a year. And to say that is immaterial is such an understatement. Like, it's laughable. But in the moment, we were doing the calculation. I think we were maybe a little bit too far in the weeds. So I guess like that would be my kind of looking back advice was don't be so far in the weeds that you lose sight of like living a better life in essence, but also understanding that like you can't just go and spend all your money because then you're just where everybody else is, right? So like there is some balance here. So Carl, what are your thoughts on this?
No babysitter, Brad.
Literally never.
I didn't think you were going to go there. I have a similar story that's just as bad, might be the wrong way to say it, but I worked for 18 years, 25 to 43. And during that time, I never took more than 5 days off of work. So I never had more than a week of vacation. And I look back now like, what the hell were you doing? You went to Hawaii and these places, you jump on a plane, fly there for 3 days and fly back or whatever. It's ridiculous. But like you, Brad, I think if Bill Perkins would have came over to my house and hit me over the head with Die with Zero, I don't think it would have made much difference. Yeah, I think I probably would have been like you, Brad. I think I would have done pretty much the exact same thing, which is kind of sad. I think it's only having this big chunk of money that has liberated me and finally caused me to think different, unfortunately. And I think that's an error in thinking. Like you said, Brad, it's a balance, but you need to enjoy life along the whole way, not just at the end.
So, would you advise that younger Carl and Mindy to spend more? I think because that's the heart of Maggie's question. Like, would you advise the younger you to spend more money?
Yes, but with guardrails, I would say still get your savings, do your 401k, get all of that stuff correct, get your investments going, but let loose a little bit. If you're dumping tons of money into post-tax investments because you've already maxed everything out, take some of that and live a little, but don't lose sight. Have that goal always in the back of the head, but focus on life. And yes, I would definitely 100% advise them to live a little while they're on the path.
And I'll push back a little, Carl. Like, I don't even think you have to max everything out if you're moving in the right direction and that's part of your plan. And yeah, I think it's okay. I think it's okay if you're not maxing it out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Doug. Not all of us might be able to max out these investments either. As long as you're, I would say just be thoughtful about your decisions. And hey, I'm going to take this trip and it might push my FI back by 6 months, but that's okay because I'm going to have a great experience when I'm 28 and don't have to wait until I'm 48 to experience the same thing.
Yeah. And for me, looking back, my 20s and 30s, I was just ignorant about what I was doing. So I took good trips, and looking back, it was actually a nice balance. So I would go into a little credit card debt, as I mentioned before, but it wasn't catastrophic, and I paid it off in short time frame. So it wasn't compounding and building up and building up. So I had some fun. If I saw a fun opportunity or a fun trip, I would take it. And over the years, after we got our finances in place and we were saving a little bit more, my wife and I have taken great trips, and we're really intentional about, road trips, and eventually moved and did some slow travel. So we really enjoyed it. So looking back, I wouldn't change too much. I maybe would advise, don't drink so much alcohol. You spend a lot of money going out for food and drinks and all that stuff. And I could have still had fun, but just less.
Yeah.
Less.
Have less fun, says Doug to his younger self. I think one thing because again, a lot of this comes down to psychology. And one thing I've been thinking about, and I don't know if this would have resonated with my younger self, but I think we always tried to save as much as we possibly could. And that was the orientation. Obviously, again, I don't think I ever got to the point of deprivation. So this was not like a sad sack story here by any means. But I think if I were to do it again, I would set a savings percentage, and then I would almost intentionally go out of my way to spend every other dollar. And I know this sounds maybe like a distinction without a difference, but I think there is a difference in the sense that when we tried to save as much as we could, it's still the orientation was around the saving instead of around the living. And I think when you set a percentage, because this is the advice that I've given to my girls, or I really truly intend to, is if you can start a framework of a life without having made any mistakes. So this is not any of us in present company, or most people certainly, but if you can start a financial life without making mistakes at 18 and just orient around saving some percentage, my advice would be 50%. If you can save 50% before you've made any mistakes, before you've built a framework of a life that costs anything, you can do anything you want with the other 50%. Literally anything. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. You can't help but fall backwards into financial success with a 50% savings rate, or whatever, 40%. I don't care what the number is, right? And I think that reorientation around the ability and freedom to spend would have been a healthier perspective than that subtle distinction of, which might have ended, frankly, guys, with the same savings rate for us. That's the funny thing. But I think that psychological difference would have helped. And I think it would have then opened up our aperture for what can we spend money on, as opposed to let's just save, save, save. So again, a very subtle distinction, but I hope there's some wisdom there that at least is resonating with someone out there.
And I think I fall into that too, especially once we figured out, the faster we save, the faster we can stop working. And the hard part for me is when you start measuring something, and here we're measuring how much you're saving, then I'm looking at how much we're saving. And if you spend more on something that you didn't need to, you get that premium cheddar cheese or whatever, then you end up making decisions to boost that metric that you're looking at. And it skews everything. So reframing it, like you said, Brad, I think is a brilliant way to do it.
Nice. Yeah, Doug, it's just so interesting how everything ties together into this being like this continuum. And it's been interesting, I've found, to see my own path change, and just like how I've conceptualized FI has really changed along the way. But I wanted to close the loop on something which might also be something that has changed in our own lives. At the very top, so Maggie's question was, am I on track? But that maybe begs the question, like, are there checkpoints along the way? Are there little milestones? And I think way back in the day, we did a stages and checkpoints of Phi episode, which people could go back and listen to. I'd be curious to go back and listen to that now and see where my own thinking is updated. But how do we think about checkpoints of Phi? Is that something that even crosses your plate? Do you think that's relevant in the new world of ChooseFI and LeanFi and all these other things that have changed?
I don't think it's relevant anymore. And I think of our community and I think of the podcast and the blogs and the actual physical community of like CampFi and economy and all that stuff. And it's really easy to get into a comparison game, which is a losing game, whether it's like income or how fast you hit Fi or even the checkpoints. It can be a little valuable in some aspect, but essentially, if you're following someone on social media and they hit Fi at some certain point and you start trying to match them, that is a way to kind of take the fun out of it. So I would encourage Maggie and her family to think about designing kind of their own game and play that. Think about it like a marathon runner. They're just trying to finish and not get injured most of the time. They're not going to win, right? So they're just trying to run their own race. And I think that's what she should focus on.
Oh, that's deep. Run your own race. Carla, what are your thoughts on running your own race, on checkpoints? Do you think there's value in having, like, I remember again in that old episode, we jokingly had the, hey, when you have $100,000 in net worth and you're signed up for personal capital, like they give you the call basically to see if they can manage your assets. But it was a cute little checkpoint. And we had a whole list of things like that. Do you think there's value in modern day Fi and having like overt checkpoints that like we as a community can come together? Or do you think you really should just run your own race?
Oof. I think you should check in with yourself to make sure money is serving you and that you're happy on your path. But the thing with money, especially if you're an index fund investor, is you're going to do whatever you're going to do. And then the rest isn't saying it's left up to chance. Sounds like I'm gambling, and it's not gambling over the long term, but there's only so much you can do, and the rest is going to be out of your control. And I'm the poster boy for thinking wrong because I said, I'm going to retire in 1,500 days. I'm going to have X amount of money, which was super silly because that stuff is out of your control. It so happened with me that there were good stock market tailwinds and I met my goal, and I hope that happens with most people, but it might not. So if you're checking in on stuff like net worth, I think that is an error. I think you should check in with stuff you can control. That's your happiness on a money level with your contributions, but then let the rest go. You'll get to Fi whenever you get to Fi, but you shouldn't think too much about it in between. Focus on life, not the numbers.
Focus on life. And I think the Stoics would echo you, control what you can control and run your own race. I mean, I think we might have just encapsulated the entire episode here in about 15 seconds. So Maggie, I hope this was useful to you. I hope this was useful to everyone out there listening who, no matter when you're starting on your path to Fi, I think this is relevant. I really do, because there's not one age, again, to start Fi. It's not that at all. But we all are on this similar journey. And there's a lot of similarities across our entire community. And I think it's been fun to grow and learn as a community in public. And I think this is what's great about being human, right, guys? Like, we can learn, we can update our thinking. We're not stuck intellectually in some year. In 2017, when ChooseFI started, my own mindset was very different than it is now. And I think I've learned and I've grown across the years. And I hope that we're helping other people think about their own lives critically. And like Doug said so beautifully, you have to run your own race. And that really is the starting point. So, am I on track? Only you can know. And I think that's the beautiful part about the path to financial independence.